Good morning. My name is Gretchen Madame Schils. I promise I will not give you a second set of opening remarks. That would be inappropriate, given that I was playing rookie yesterday morning. That would be doubly inappropriate. But, you know, I just wanted to say we started with such a wonderful set of lectures yesterday. And one works on these events for years in advance. I mean, first it was the grant that we applied for, and then about a year in advance we start thinking about, you know, whom to invite, and voila, here you all are. It's really wonderful to have you here, and I hope we'll have a great second day of lectures. Well, I'm confident that we will. I do want to take a moment to take Christopher Anabnit, who's really, and he might still be out there, but who's really the driving force behind the logistics and bringing all of this together. I mean, it's so wonderful that all I needed to do was to get the list of speakers together, and then the rest of it we could just hand over to Chris. My final point is, I do want to make a shout out to Teresa Corey. The History of Philosophy Forum has made a tremendous difference for my academic environment at Notre Dame. And I think she really is the model of somebody who's both herself a very prominent scholar, but who also believes in empowering the work of others. The second one is a bit more rare in academia, shall we say. And she's created a truly interdisciplinary forum that allows us to approach the history of philosophy in the richest manner possible. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful to Teresa for her leadership. And so we go on to our first talk today by Amy Schmitter from the University of Alberta, and she talks, I really needed a program to be able to read the title, would never have been able to remember it. Affective Remedy, Government and Standards, Naturalistic Strategies for Ameliorating the Passions in Early Modern Philosophy. Amy, take it away.
I think I might actually stand up here so that I can see the slides a bit better. We've got the pathetic syllogism. Oh, yeah, let's see. So, yes, I want to say thanks for thinking of me for this. Not quite, you know, we're not privy to how the sausage is being made, but the results are really great. And I thought that all of the papers yesterday were just super. I learned so much. But for the sake of diversity, I'm going to give you something you won't learn anything from. I do have slides, but they're very messy, and the transitions are screwed up. So it's one of the reasons I want to kind of keep an eye on them. This paper, I was going to say it's sort of part of a larger work, but it's a larger work only because it's got fragments all over the place. And a lot of it has been dusted off, and it exists in something like 5 different lengths. So trying to cut it for this, I'm pretty sure I left out important things like, you know, what I'm doing and you know, all prepositions. But the kind of general project, or the ideas that I have concern how various early modern philosophers, particularly Descartes, Spinoza, Hobbes, and in a longer version of this, Hume, so how do they address the amelioration of what they call variously passions, affects, or sentiments? So this paper actually started as a contribution to a contribution in the before time, so it was a long time ago, to a workshop on naturalism in, get this, Spinoza, Hume, and Nietzsche. And we were supposed to talk about all of them, and like, I got nobody. No, Don Rutherford did, yeah, but you know, I got in just snippets of Nietzsche, and then I added Hobbes and Descartes, so I thought I had done my duty. Anyway, I hope the relevance for this setting is clear. I take it as one of my central theses that many of the practical ethical issues, so to speak, theory of practical issues perhaps, that engage at least the better known early modern philosophers were matters of reforming character, including sort of moral psychology in general, for which the passions and other affects were both objects and tools. So as such, let's see if this works. Oh yeah, this is what I'm doing right there. As such, they approached many fundamental problems in ethics, particularly weakness of will, as demanding adjustments in our affective psychology. By the way, one other thing. So I do have the slides, but some of them I won't be reading them out. They're there for evidence. And I stuck them into the handout section on the web so that they're available if you want to take a look at them. I didn't want to print them all out because they were way too long, but I do want people to tell me if they think that the passages I cite do not help at all. Anyway, I have several other theses besides this, but to save time, I am simply going to declare them, which is why I call this a manifesto. One thesis is that the turn to the passions often served naturalistic aims in early modern philosophy. And that's really vague. And nobody wants to be unnatural. But I think we can specify several hallmarks that are representative of that. So first, the passions and affects are to be explained in ways consistent with the best available natural philosophy, which for most 17th century folks, among the better known ones at least, meant that it has to be consistent with mechanistic physics. Hand in hand with that is the refusal to bring in teleological causation, at least for dealing with physical things. There we go. And linked with that is a tendency to identify the sources of values of good and bad, or evil, in the determinations of the passions. There we go. At least these are features of the philosophers I'm going to talk about, who were then left to explain psychic conflict in novel ways, indeed holding that the affects stand in need. Oh, sorry, I missed something. Okay, so two other features are worth remarking. First, the rejection of sharp divisions and hierarchies in the soul. And second, an antipathy towards setting reason and passion in opposition. I mean, sometimes that comes up, but I don't think actually a deeply committed position. And yes, so, but all of this makes it somewhat difficult, perhaps, to capture the thought that the affects stand in need of remediation. That seems to me kind of difficult to capture in a naturalistic framework where you're suggesting something like the passions and the affects are determining good and evil. And so early modern advocates often needed to find new tools. So in short, for various reasons and in various ways, Hobbes, Spinoza, and later Hume looked to the amelioration of what they called the passions or affects, or with Hume later, sentiments, to address central moral or political problems. So yet another thesis here is that the vocabulary choices matter. It matters not only what affective states are called, whether, of which there's a number, but whether their amelioration, I'm using amelioration as just the vaguest term I can find, is a matter of remedy, of regulation, of mastery, of moderation, of government, of finding a standard, which I think it is for Hume. I think yesterday you mentioned management. That's another good one. So these differences are not some sort of exegetical magic bullet, but I think that the changing terminology can be telling, and that it emerges from a branching history of philosophical problems. So here what I'm really going to do is look at how Spinoza in the Ethics brings in both remedy for and government of the passions by appropriating materials from Descartes and Hobbes and turning them to his own ends. In the, again, third section, which I won't be touching on and is very messy, I do something, I hope, similar with Hume. So what I hope to sketch here is a process of evolution, kind of a genealogy, but one that's just as messy as any biological one. So this is mostly what I'll be talking about. Now, Spinoza introduces his discussion of the affects in part 3 of the Ethics with a Naturalist Manifesto. So he rails against most of those who have written about the affects on the grounds that they seem to treat not of natural things, which follow the common laws of nature, but of things which are outside nature, and even to conceive man in nature as a dominion within a dominion. Here the main target is Descartes, to whom Spinoza attributes the view that humans can exercise absolute dominion over their actions and affects. I think that's it. He also kind of includes Spinoza, and includes the Stoics in this later. So on Spinoza's view, this commits Descartes to thinking that the soul has its own domain of free and independent action, which can alter the very institutions governing mind-body interaction, even to the point of seizing control over the pineal gland by pure volition alone. Spinoza instead proposes to explain what the mind can do to moderate the affects, and to determine by the mind's knowledge alone the remedies for the affects. Now, what really sticks in Spinoza's craw is the talk of the soul's freedom. So he thoroughly rejects any view that we can master affects originating from the environment, that is to say, passions, insofar as they enter some sort of internal psychic space riven from the rest of nature. Now, here I think actually Spinoza slightly misreads what Descartes calls the remedies for the passions are supposed to work. At least it's an uncharitable reading. Malebranche does it better. But Spinoza assumes that Descartes thinks we can alter the connections between the movements in the pineal gland and mental events, be they perceptions or volitions. In fact, I think Descartes describes the remedies that give us the best chance for long-term success as deploying the corporeal imagination to modify the connective pathways in the brain and thereby reshape our dispositions of response to the objects of various passions through a kind of habituation. He introduces the pineal gland as the relay point. Is this on? Okay. He introduces the pineal gland as the relay point for mind-body interaction in the Passions of the Soul, section 43, to explain psychic conflict without resorting to struggles between higher and lower parts of the soul. Instead, the pineal gland can be caught between opposing motions, some initiated by the will, and some caused, maintained, and strengthened by some movement of the animal spirits in the body. That's Descartes' description of the bodily aspect of passions. So there may be a few people who have sufficiently strong wills, or strong souls, rather, to hold out against some of the motions coming from the body, especially these ones that are caused, maintained, and strengthened by animal spirits. But those people are very few and far between, and Descartes does not propose that we embark on some program of mental calisthenics to subjugate the passions through sheer psychic force. So unlike the stereotypes of the Stoics with whom Spinoza associates him, Descartes sees the passions as valuable. He calls them all by nature good. We need them to maneuver our way around the world, perceiving the value of things in relation to us, so as to maintain the integrity of our bodies and thus the union of mind and body. The passions need remedies insofar as they're subject to excess and disorder that may sometimes be overwhelming. They can thus present us with seeming goods that might conflict with other goods we have or that inhibit our freedom to determine our own goods. Let's see. For this, Descartes recommends the practice of virtue, and in particularly the virtue of what he calls generosity, which provides, as he puts it, a sovereign and general remedy, the French remède, for the passions, But generosity itself is a passion. It's a form of wonder at our own free will. It counts as a virtue when it becomes habitual and resolute. And so excessive passions are remedied by developing a disposition to experience wonder and esteem for our own free will, and concomitantly at its use and control, such that we resolve to use it well. Now, for all of his complaints that Descartes was too clever by half, Spinoza offers a very similar picture of those who do what they can to avoid the excesses of the passions by living according to reason or virtue. Now, Spinoza does not speak of generosity, but rather of self-esteem, or acquiescentia in se ipso. Yeah, it's up there. Which he introduces as a joy accompanied with the idea of oneself as a cause, and then defines more precisely as arising from considering oneself and one's own power of acting. Now, both Cartesian generosity and Spinozistic self-esteem thus arise from a sense of our own efficacy with respect to what is, so to speak, most proper to us. Both also have similar downstream effects on character. So Spinoza declares that those with self-esteem avoid repentance, suffer neither from great pride nor from great despondency, have no excessive desires, are not guided by fear, including the fear of death, prefer greater future goods to lesser present ones, act honestly, and are most thankful to other free men or humans. And I think Descartes ascribes many similar traits to the generous. So I'm not reading all of those, but that's actually meant to be evidence of this claim. There's a central difference, though. Spinoza declares that self-esteem grows out of a sense of one's own power. It does not pick out either what Descartes considers to be our free will or our volitions, which Descartes specifies particularly as the objects esteemed by the generous. And so Spinoza rejects the picture of virtue that carves out a space in which to wonder at our own free will. The sense of our active potency remains important, but Spinoza shapes it to fit his naturalism. So to understand Spinoza's turn to an affect arising from a sense of our own power, I think it helpful to turn to Hobbes, who is perhaps the predecessor most important for Spinozistic naturalism. And there we go. There are at least two main features of Hobbes' thought that are important precursors to Spinoza's naturalism about the affects. First is their shared monism, although the monism that constitutes Hobbes' monism differs greatly from Spinoza's infinitely variegated substance. Hobbes is committed to locating everything within a single natural world, subject to the same explanatory principles. Let's see. Oh, that's not what I wanted, but it's coming up. Second, Hobbes rejects final causation utterly in favor of mechanical, efficient causation. So when Hobbes declares that the passions are the interior beginnings of voluntary motions, he really does mean that they are small locomotions, what he also calls endeavors. That is, motions before they appear in walking, speaking, striking, and other visible actions. In setting large-scale actions in motion, the passions translate vital motions into animal motions. They also typically give those motions a direction, making them either appetite or aversion, according to the pleasure or displeasure we find in objects. The passions also determine in the first instance what we mean by good and bad. So here, a fairly famous claim from Hobbes that whatever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is that which he, for his part, calleth good, and the object of his hate and aversion evil, right? And so they're relative terms, at least in the state of nature. Now, the aim here is not only to press that values are relative, but to reverse the order of explanation that supposes that our appetites and aversions track ends and thus fall under the principles of final causation. Indeed, the appetites and aversions determine the value of their objects and operate as moving causes from the person of the man. Now, Leviathan 6, there we go. There. Leviathan 6 declares that life itself is but motion and can never be without desire. For this reason, Hobbes denies that there is any finis ultimus, utmost aim, nor summum bonum, greatest good. Any, I quote, appetite pursue, sorry, I'm having trouble with this, these stupid verbs, but any appetite presupposeth a farther end, and so there can be no contentment but in proceeding. Hobbes' understanding of felicity builds from this perpetual motion vision. Felicity or happiness is but a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. Or more simply, as he puts it in Leviathan again, continual prospering. In this picture, appetites or desires, including aversions, are fundamental to life itself. Passions are the ways in which appetites are differentiated as motivations to action, and so voluntary actions manifest appetite itself. And this holds even for acts of reasoning. Practical deliberation is an alienation of passions, which ends by issuing an action, and wit in general is driven by desires and passions. And so Hobbes insists the desires and other passions of man are in themselves no sin. It thus may seem quite odd that Hobbes sometimes suggests that the passions can lead us astray cognitively. Leviathan ends by contrasting the faculty of solid reasoning grounded upon the principles of truth with the passions and interests of men, which are different and mutable. In the work De Sive, Hobbes tells us that out of civil society there is dominion of passions, but in it the dominion of reason. I got that. Yeah, I got that too. Sorry, at one point Leviathan even identifies an excess of passions with madness. But Hobbes, I'm just kind of curious what he means by these contrasts, and I think it's not really a contrast between any sort of like faculties here. And particularly when it comes to ameliorating the passions, Hobbes doesn't suppose that, say, reason itself can do much to remediate the situation. It's not as if an individual's reason could restrain or resist their passions. Pretty much the only thing capable of constraining passions are other passions, and that's because passions are motions, and motion is resisted not by rest, but by contrary motion. So thus, when Hobbes turns to our motivations to obey the injunctions and recommendations laid down by natural law, that is, say, precepts and general rules found out by reason, which all command you to preserve yourself. But when he's, what sort of motivates us there is a passion. It's a passion that's to be reckoned upon, namely, and most efficaciously, fear. There we go, yeah. Let me see. Yes, that's right. Unlike Descartes, Hobbes' worries about the passions really don't center on our ability to pursue what we determine freely to be our true goods. The thought that passions might interfere with individuals' self-determination as individuals is largely foreign to Hobbes. Rather, his main concern lies with how the passions might prompt social conflict, particularly war and the violation of natural laws. Individuals are motivated by passions, but if those motivations remain uncoordinated, they will act in ways that obstruct and frustrate each other's appetites. The most extreme fragmentation and greatest conflict arise in the condition of mere nature. for which Hobbes identifies three principal causes of quarrel. The first, competition, arises from a direct clash of individuals' desires for the same object that cannot be shared. The second and third are passions themselves, diffidence and glory. All thus arise from behavior motivated by perfectly natural passions, but under conditions where nothing organizes the collection of individual pursuits of ends. So because disparate individuals show a diversity of tempers, customs, and doctrines, when private appetite is the measure of good and evil, we are in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war. Indeed, Hobbes thinks that this diversity of passions means we will not even agree about the means to various ends. So diverse men, too far. Diverse men differ not only in their judgments on the sense of what is pleasant and unpleasant to the taste, smell, hearing, touch, and sight, but also what is conformable or disagreeable to reason in the actions of common life. Now, glory is a particularly, let me get that one, that's that one. Glory is a particularly interesting cause of quarrel because it's tied very closely to Hobbes' understanding of felicity and to the appetite for power. Let me see, because felicity is a matter of procuring the way of future desire, Hobbes holds it for, I quote, a general inclination of all mankind, Hobbes holds that it is a general inclination of all mankind to pursue a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. And the cause of this is because he cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he hath present, without the acquisition of more. So now it might seem here as if Hobbes is supposing that we're practically rational, that because we desire felicity, we also desire the means to felicity. But I don't think Hobbes does not need to suppose that we always obey the hypothetical imperative, because he supposes that we're disposed to experience glory. Glory is a passion, joy arising from an imagination of man's own power and ability. He gives slightly different descriptions of it in different works, but that will work for now. Our tendency is to feel joy in the sense of our own power is a motivation to seek power independent of rational considerations of its utility. However, seeking or enjoying power in the condition of mere nature is typically antagonistic to the appetites of others, since glory there usually manifests itself in power over others, and particularly when we're seeking power in the eyes of others, which Hobbes calls reputation, and is a perfectly legitimate form of power. Motivations of glory always seem like potential powder kegs for Hobbes, and chapter 10 of Leviathan offers numerous ways to channel glory seeking into a proliferation of non-exclusive opportunities for glory. And Hobbes particularly talks about the way in which honors can be created and recognized, and particularly within a state. It's a very interesting discussion, I think. There's lots of interesting comparisons to be made with the first paper on Aristotle and the notion of honor. I'm not going to go into it now further, though. But what we can see is that in a condition of rough equality of power, glory tends to fuel attempted displays of dominance that frustrate the appetites of others and may indeed threaten the life and well-being of the glory seekers themselves, dueling, for instance. Since the central problem, I think, is a lack of coordination among the passions and the actions they motivate, the remedy is to govern the passions so that they come into alignment. And that's what the sovereign does. Its central device for governing the passions that would otherwise fragment the body politic is the threat of coercive power. Manifest threat, in turn, raises the passion of fear within its subjects. Fear here now can be understood as a kind of respect, and indeed is closely tied with honor. And it's consistent with love. But I think that Hobbes emphasizes fear to highlight its effectiveness in bridling individual appetites and other passions, and thus coordinating behavior among subjects under the direction of the sovereign. In this way, the sovereign fixes a common measure of good and evil, which is a genuinely public reason that supplants merely private appetites or private determinations of good and evil. It's the top-down government of the passions that allows the construction of an artificial man by naturalistic means, and it gives it its raison d'être. Good, yes. I was very proud that I could download this on a stinking keynote last night. Wanted to get that picture in. But here's where I'd like to return to Spinoza to address why Descartes' approach to remedying the passions would seem unsatisfactory and insufficiently naturalistic, I was going to say, to him. Like Hobbes, Spinoza rejects explanation in terms of ineliminable final causes. Nature does nothing on account of an end. Like Hobbes, Spinoza makes our value determiners, I should say, our passions and affects. So insofar as a thing affects us with joy or sadness, we call it good or evil. You got that? Yeah. Last, although Hobbes does not use the same metaphysical language, identifying appetite and desire with the very life of a human being comes close to Spinoza's claim that desire is man's very essence. Likewise, Hobbes' commitment to motion as what knits together a living thing in its vital and voluntary operations foreshadows Spinoza's proposition that the striving by which each thing strives to persevere in its being is nothing but the actual essence of the thing. Now, because of the metaphysics of finite modes, Spinoza emphasizes our necessary dependence on and involvement with our environments much more than Descartes or even Hobbes do. So we can never bring it about that we require nothing outside of ourselves to preserve our being, nor that we live without having dealings with things outside of us. Yeah. Indeed, we're metaphysically dependent on our environments just to come into being, insofar as the preceding chain of transitive causes determines our existence as singular things. So to this extent, Spinoza thinks we must have something in common with our environments. But it doesn't follow from our basic metaphysical dependency that we are always so attuned to our environments that we can thrive. Spinoza focuses the dangers of a hostile environment into the passions, including the way they may shape our relations to others. So because we're subject to passions, we can disagree in nature and be changeable and inconstant. The result is that insofar as men are torn by affects that are passions, they can be contrary to one another. Passions may, in fact, increase our power of striving and unite us with others, as happens with joy and certain kinds of love. But as Spinoza's talk of tearing and making people contrary to one another shows, he recognizes much the same coordination problems as those identified by Hobbes. And those problems provide much of the same prima facie reason for contrasting being torn by the passions and living according to the guidance of reason. Spinoza, again, like Hobbes, holds that affects can only be restrained or taken away by other affects. And in the ethics, also finds a role for fear. No affect can be restrained except by an affect stronger than and contrary to the affect to be restrained, and everyone refrains from doing harm out of timidity regarding a greater harm. So to be no surprise that he presupposes that the heterogeneity and conflict engendered by such passions be redressed by similarly governmental means. Oh, did I go backwards? Right. There we go. No. There we go. All right. So society can be maintained, providing it appropriates to itself the right everyone has of avenging himself and of judging concerning good and evil. In this way, society has the power to prescribe a common rule of life, to make laws and maintain them, not by reason, which cannot restrain the affects, but by threats. This society maintained by laws and the power it has of preserving itself is called a state, okay? And in a civil state, of course, it is decided by common agreement what is good and what is evil, and everyone is bound to submit to the state. So that sounds very much like Hobbes, right? So to counter divisive passions, society appropriates a coercive power of judgment and establishes itself as a public measure of good and evil, much as Hobbes described. Now, Spinoza also follows Hobbes by insisting on individual citizens' obligation to obey. But for Spinoza, this obligation is a consequence of following true virtue, which is nothing but living according to the guidance of reason and in accord with our own nature. It demands that everyone love himself, seek his own advantage, what is really useful to him, want what will really lead a man to greater perfection, and absolutely that everyone should strive to preserve his own being as far as he can. Although it's much more robust, his dictum is very much consistent with what Hobbes calls the very form of a law of nature, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or taketh away the means of preserving the same, or to admit the means by which he thinketh it might be best preserved. But whereas Hobbes' talk of natural law and its obligations seems to come out of nowhere, Spinoza ties the notion of virtue and its prescriptions to our nature as a singular things. Right? Each thing, as far as it can by its own power, strives to persevere in its being, and that striving is its essence. So by talking of perfection, Spinoza tells us to understand reality, that is the essence of each thing insofar as it exists and produces an effect, not an affect, and the virtue that leads a person to greater perfection is simply whatever leads to an increase in the power of acting. Now, what allows Spinoza to have the prescriptions of virtue flow from our very nature, even as he denies that nature works according to ends, is his dynamic metaphysics, in which striving itself can increase or decrease, and which we measure by the affects. Passions and affects, I should say. It also means that he will not rest with Hobbes' techniques for governing the passions. State coercive power is required since people are subject to the passive affects, which far surpass man's power or virtue. And so we are often drawn in different directions and are contrary to one another, while we also require one another's aid. But needing state threats to ensure that one refrain from doing harm out of timidity and does good to avoid evil is not to be guided by reason. The ultimate remedy for the passions should increase our power, and thus is virtue, as it was for Descartes. In contrast, because he tends to think that humans naturally love liberty and dominion over others, Hobbes only connects obedience to natural law and the pursuit of power and felicity instrumentally. The closest he might get to the sort of psychodynamics that treat striving to preserve one's own being with appetite is in the passion of glory. But again, Hobbesian glory is both a potent cause of war and a passion that needs careful management in commonwealth. It doesn't serve to connect virtue and power as Spinoza does. I've got a little more to go, but we started a bit late. Is that okay? All right. What I think this shows is that Hobbes and Spinoza have rather different views of the power of individuals and how the power of individuals relates to the power of other individuals. For Hobbes, establishing an unequal and sovereign coercive power in commonwealth constrains the powers of individuals. It also coordinates it, either channeling it into non-combative forms or compounding it to establish the power of a state. so that individuals are not systematically frustrated by others. So thus, the effects of a sovereign power is to enable individuals to do more than they would otherwise. But whereas Hobbes allows that the greatest of human powers is that which is compounded of the powers of most men, he divides fairly sharply between the natural powers of individuals and the instrumental powers that belong to a supra-individual artificial person. The power of the latter aids the power of the individual, mostly by clearing obstacles out of its way. There may also be instrumental powers that belong to natural individuals, as when a master commands servants or a popular person convinces friends and admirers to help with some action, like moving house. But in general, it looks as if any gain in power from the power of others for an individual is offset, for an individual, I should say, it's offset by constraint in power as the price of cooperation, even while the power of the whole grows. Now, perhaps Hobbes doesn't need to maintain that, but at the very least, he doesn't seem to recognize much of a sense in which living with others can be liberating and empowering for individuals, except instrumentally. Instead, as he says, men have no pleasure, but on the contrary, a great deal of grief in keeping company, at least where there's no power able to overawe them all. Hobbes does not, I think, share Spinoza's thought that the greatest good is common to all and can be enjoyed by all equally, even if he does maintain that the best conditions for the pursuit of individual felicity arise within the commonwealth. In contrast, Spinoza insists that a man who is guided by reason is more free in a state. Even his nod to Hobbes' artificial man of the Commonwealth seems to involve a greater emphasis on how the striving of one can aid the striving of others. So here we get this great passage, to man there is nothing more useful than man, nothing more helpful to the preservation of all his being than that they should so agree in all things that the minds and bodies of all would compose, as it were, one mind and one body. All should strive together as far as they can to preserve their being, and all together should seek for themselves the common advantage of all. So here, another aspect of Spinoza's metaphysics seem to do a lot of the work. Hobbes says little about our species being. He does maintain that we're roughly equal, but it's an equality of threat and it's correlative hope, not some sort of essential conformity in our striving. But Spinoza insists very strongly that humans can agree in nature, and that insofar as a thing agrees with our nature, it is necessarily good. And so for Spinoza, the use of state threats and coercive power is a stopgap measure, while we strive to bring everybody to the guidance of reason. Indeed, Spinoza points out in the Spinoza points out in the Theological Political Treatise that to govern by fear is inherently unstable. So invoking fear may be useful, but it can have only an instrumental value. For as an affect, it inhibits the power of acting and reduces perfection. It can only be, for Spinoza, a passion, something received from outside. And so it's not conformable to being guided by reason and acting as a free person. It's far better, even when dealing with a citizenry that remains in bondage to its passions and in need of governance, that, quote, people should be kept in bounds by the hope of some greatly desired good rather than fear, and be urged to do their duty from devotion rather than fear. And I think this leads into Spinoza's proposals for a very non-Hobbesian sort of structure of government in Spinoza's political treatises, which I hope to get into further later, but I won't talk about it here. Ultimately, we can hope that the government that wrangles those in bondage will work to develop the power and reason of the citizens, allowing them more and more to act as free people under the guidance of reason. It may at first play upon the passions of the citizens to prompt them to avoid inconstancy and changeability and to behave in ways that agree in nature. But since to every action to which we are determined from an affect, which is a passion, we can be determined by reason without that affect, a citizenry that is shaped by such a government can develop into free people living according to the guidance of reason. Here is where Spinoza can turn from government of the passions to the remedy for the affects, and where the remedy that Spinoza proposes starts to look more like Cartesian generosity. So reason can give rise to self-esteem, that acquiescentia in se ipso, and insofar as this affect is born from reason, such self-esteem is really the highest thing we can hope for. Self-esteem, again, is joy born of the fact that a man considers himself and his own power of acting. I take it that anybody acting freely under the guidance of reason will thus experience acquiescentia in se ipso, an increase in power, and thus yet more self-esteem in a self-reinforcing loop. So in this respect, acquiescentia in se ipso is pretty actually similar to the way Hobbes characterizes glory, joy arising from an imagination of man's own power and ability. But whereas Hobbes allows that glory may rest on imaginings that are deceptive or even more relative to others, Spinoza's account requires that self-esteem rests on a genuine increase in power. And if the joy that it involves is a hilaritas, an increase in power that is a perfection. So for this reason, I think we can associate acquiescentia in se ipso with all the remedies for the affects that the mind considered only in itself can do against the affects. It may not be a supreme remedy in quite the way Descartes proposes for generosity, but it manifests that the mind is doing what it can to exercise its power vis-a-vis the affects, particularly by knowing and thus reordering them, connecting them together and separating them from the ideas of external causes, so that the person grows ever more active. Since self-esteem is itself an affect, this person does not destroy the affects, but makes them their own, incorporating them into their striving. The result is a picture of self-esteem as a remedy that I think looks a lot like Cartesian generosity. But Spinoza gets there in a way that accords with his naturalism and requires no domain within a domain. Instead, he achieves the remedy for the affects by going through the government of the passions, by explaining how to harness the power that nature exercises on us as a means to become an active and free person. And that's it.